This is an online lecture by Dr. Bente Scheller, held at Eberhard Karls University of Tübingen on May 20th, 2020, upon an invitation by the research group of Middle East Politics and Comparative Politics at the Institute of Political Science. The title of the lecture is Syria's Future: What Role Remains for Europe? 9 years after the peaceful protests began, Assad's military victory in Syria seems certain. The price is high. Over half the population has fled. Hundreds of thousands are dead or disappeared, quote unquote. And although war crimes and crimes against humanity have hardly ever been documented more comprehensively in any conflict, they are only very rarely prosecuted under criminal law. However, prominent cases have recently been opened in Germany against both regime officials and ISIS members. But the Geneva process, in which a transition of power was agreed upon, is already stalled for too long a time. In the formats that have been created by Assad's allies, Russia and Iran, the Astana conferences and the Sochi process, no measurable progress has been made. So what role can Europe play in this context? What are the prospects for refugees to return home to Syria? What effects do the European-imposed sanctions have? And what obligations does the European Union have in view of the constantly deteriorating humanitarian situation in large parts of Syria? To answer all these questions, the research group has invited Dr. Bente Scheller, director of the Middle East and North Africa section of Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Berlin, to give a lecture in her field of expertise. Bente has worked for the German embassy in Damascus before the Syrian uprisings and war. She has headed the Kabul country office of the Böll Foundation in Afghanistan. She also acted as country director in Beirut at the Böll Foundation's office there in Lebanon, also being in charge of cooperation inside Syria from Beirut. This was after the Syrian uprisings and the start of the Syrian war. And therefore, we have a great expert here to talk about the process in Syria and the options for the European Union. The lecture has been recorded, but for technical reasons, the first slides of these presentations have not been recorded. The subsequent discussion with students has not been recorded for privacy and data protection regulation reasons. Dr. Scheller started with a brief overview with the help of a map of Syria that demonstrated that in particular in the northeast of the country, where the Syrian democratic forces, mainly Kurdish but not only, cooperative with the regime but not identical to the regime, control the territory and the borders. And in the north, where Turkey is still part of the game, and where the successor organization of the Nusra Front, HTS, is the last opposition-controlled stronghold in the Idlib province, all of this demonstrates that the regime's goal to control all borders and the influx of resources is far from achieved. On the second slide, Dr. Bente Scheller shifts the focus on the actors involved, and mainly on the international actors. On the Western side, the question is what policy options can the EU and Germany have, who have traditionally been embedded in the Western context where NATO is a major player, as it also has been in the establishment of a no-fly zone in Libya. And of course, the United States, traditionally the hegemonic force in the Middle East, has been weakened since the Obama administration and does not provide guidance to Europe or Germany. The random policies pursued under the Trump administration with intervention and no intervention have demonstrated that the US are no source of guidance and not a reliable partner in Middle East policies. In particular, the decision taken by the Trump administration in December 2019 to no longer cooperate with its former Kurdish allies has created skepticism among many actors. Moreover, the recent rift between Turkey and the United States doesn't bode well for integrated Western policy actions. But also, Russia and Iran have proven to be problematic allies of Syria. Increasing Russian pressure on the Syrian regime has been witnessed recently, And Russia and Iran are not partners that are looking in the same direction, in the words of Bente Scheller. They do not want to go further than support the regime diplomatically and militarily, and there might be a point in time when the presidency might be let down. To evaluate possible entry points for the European Union, one would have to look on the ground, according to Bente Scheller, to see that there is a problematic relationship now between Russia and Syria, that the Lebanese crisis plays into this, the heavy economic crisis Lebanon faces, which of course is directly related to events in Syria. And we also have to see that the lack of discipline in the Syrian regime forces is not an ideal setting for Russia. Russia too needs a certain minimal degree of stability in order to go back to negotiations. So the performance of the Syrian army and security apparatus has been disappointing. This is where the recording starts, and where the recording ends is the end of the presentation and the start of the discussion. We hope you enjoy watching.
In Idlib. So that, of course, was a big puzzle for NATO, for the EU, how to handle this. What would they do if here we would face a conflict because of Turkey's engagement? And therefore, we can see in the realm of the normal allies, or those who we would address when looking for solutions, we find different problems with different allies. And therefore, I think this is a very problematic situation for the EU, that also internally is divided and then lacks major allies outside. If we look at the other side, the regime side, they also have allies. I mentioned Russia already. The second strongest ally that they are dependent on is Iran, and I think you can really say without these two, the Syrian regime as such would not have survived. They are absolutely essential for everything that happens. Russia mainly when it comes to giving air support for military offensives, and then the Iranian troops, but mainly their proxies, Hezbollah and other groups that they recruited in Afghanistan and Pakistan. These are the relevant forces on the ground where Russia is less engaged. So these two are, in a direct military sense, extremely important. But of course, that is it comes with consequences. On the political level, it is relevant because these two cannot be ignored when it comes to decision making and political change that might be intended and that has been high up on the EU's agenda. But also when it comes to questions of economy, of construction, reconstruction, etc. These are relevant because they've been paying for what they've been doing, and they expect revenues coming from Syria. So they, at the moment, are both competing for economic influence as well, and we can be pretty sure whatever is being sent to Syria in terms of humanitarian aid and further recovery aid, or later on reconstruction, Russia and Iran will make sure that they will get a major share of this. So we have problematic allies on our own. We have problematic allies on the Syrian regime side. We don't see really cooperation partners that are looking in the same direction, which is quite unusual for the EU, and especially in such a difficult and such a relevant conflict for the EU. It's a very specific setting. Then, of course, if we look into what would be possible entry points for the EU, not only this bigger setting on the international level is relevant, but we have to go down to the ground and see what are major problems inside. You've probably followed the development in the Middle East that is related to the Lebanese crisis. It is a huge economic crisis that is happening in Lebanon, but Syria is completely connected to it because of the connection between the banks, because of Lebanon being one of the places through which Syria can do deals and can have money entering that it cannot have through Turkey or Iraq or any of the other neighbors. So the economic crisis, after all these years of an exhausting war, is hitting Syria very hard. And here we see also disagreements between the Syrian regime that is not able to address these and the allies that are not willing to come to help the regime. They've helped it militarily and politically and diplomatically, but they don't want to invest. They don't want to go further. They are certainly both not on the page of humanitarian aid deliveries. So when we look into what is happening on the ground in Syria, we have one major problem from the Russian perspective, particularly. Let's see where to continue. No, that was too far. Yes, this is it. The lack of discipline. For Russia, the ideal setting in which they feel comfortable with handing over and going for a peace process, so to say, the ideal situation and the minimum is that there is a certain degree of stability. This would force others to negotiate seriously. This would make it more likely that others agree that there is a chance for peace. So they want a minimum of security, stability, and for that, of course, you need security forces that are implementing it. Russia has, over the years, come to the conclusion if they don't do that on their own, they are lost. They cannot rely on their Syrian partners. They have been very disappointed by the Syrian army from the very beginning. If you remember, before the conflict, the Syrian army and the Syrian security apparatus was considered one of the biggest and the best in the whole Middle East. During the war, it quickly eroded through defections, through being hit hard by the very ill-equipped opposition, you have to say, hit hard also by developments that then brought more weapons into Syria, but altogether, the Syrian army, after already 2 years of conflict, it was down to half its size. And then, of course, their elite troops are much smaller. So this was what made it necessary to have such a strong engagement of other groups, and here particularly Hezbollah. And the Hezbollah is very, very hierarchical, very strictly organized. They have experience in fighting. And so this is why for Iran it was essential to deploy them and have them also leading battles, not just supporting the Syrian army, but on the contrary, they would lead battles, the Syrian army would join these. But what Hezbollah then often complained about is a lack of discipline, saying we go and fight, we liberate areas, we go into areas and establish control. When the Syrian army comes, they first loot and then they abuse the situation. We do the fighting and we allow them to enter, but what they do is not that they build on it, but rather they undermine it by looting and by also arresting people, by harassing people. So that always was a problem. And down here, the picture that you see, it's from Yarmouk, the formerly Palestinian area in Damascus, and this is after Yarmouk was just conquered back by the regime, and you see many soldiers carrying fridges and washing machines. Somebody did the meme that you can see up here, the shoulder parts of the Syrian army here with gas cylinders, washing machines, and ventilators instead of the stars. So it was a phenomenon that every area witnessed, something that made the army very unpopular, something that shows about the state of the army and why there might be a lack of trust of Russia that the Syrian army and security forces can handle the situation on their own. And that, of course, is relevant because if you don't have security institutions that can be trusted to at least keep a kind of quiet, if they are part of the troublemaking and if you have to rely on many other militias, then the situation is not easy to handle. And for Russia, this is also one of the points in which they disagree with Iran, because for Iran, the groups that they can manage one by one are more interesting, while for Russia, the very hierarchical approach with one structure, like an army, that's more important. So we have those two allies not agreeing on how security and safety should be established in Syria, with the effect that especially the south is very, very unstable. We have lots of assassinations, kidnappings, and attacks, even though the south has been under regime control formally now for a few years already. We have the same in eastern Aleppo, which never went back to anything like quiet. And we always had a very, very unstable situation right in the middle of the country. In Hama province, it was always controlled by a tiny patchwork of militias. And this is not ideal if you want to sell that you manage to not only keep the Syrian regime in place, but that the positive effect of it is the stability that European governments have always been asking for. This is not really a good start. Second, corruption. Here you see the cousin of the president, Rami Makhlouf. He was from the very beginning of Bashar's presidency on the person in Syria that was allowed to benefit in the broadest way in corruption, to take all the businesses from mobile phone licenses to the duty-free shops to media and oil. Rami Makhlouf was always the one that was allowed to first pick what he wanted, then he'd get it, and he'd be able to harvest from it as much as he wanted. This is why people used to call him Rami al-Harami, like Rami the thief, Rami the criminal. Recently, he published 3 videos now in which he's pretending to be a victim of the regime. He's complaining that they arrest people working with him, and that really he's complaining about corruption while he was the biggest beneficiary of it, especially during the war. So here he recently transformed to what in the meme is displayed as Saint Makhlouf. Russia has, at the same time of Rami Makhlouf's campaign, been complaining about corruption. It comes complementary, the external complaint about it as well as the internal one, even though, of course, Rami is not the right one to complain about it, but it is quite spectacular that they address this problem so openly and in this way. For Russia, of course, they are not interested in real good governance, but on the contrary, they try to get as much of the share as they can. And of course, if somebody always has the privilege to benefit, he is not on their list of favorites. So they might also have been pressure to take his assets, because this is what the regime has been doing. They confiscated his assets, possibly to show that they are working against corruption. But I think this case simply shows how big the phenomenon is. And as you know, corruption is connected to governance, and it is connected to how you can lead politics. And in this case also on how you can bring peace to the country. And of course, corruption curbs the ways that external interference, external support in this case, by financial means can have effects. The more corruption, the less effect on the positive side for citizens it can have. We therefore have the biggest thing the EU is currently doing for Syria, humanitarian aid, always under the question, is this really helping? Is it efficient? The EU is very committed, and you can see here some current facts, how much they already delivered. Their Syria response is not happening exclusively inside. Most of it is going to refugees, to the millions of refugees that are outside Syria in the neighboring countries. But in any case, the EU is one of the major donors for humanitarian aid in Syria. You can here see how big they are in the UN Syria response plan. The 2020 figures here show that Germany, the European Commission, together have a share of 33%. There are, of course, other European states that are coming down in the list. So the share altogether of European states in humanitarian aid and relief and supporting neighboring states to deal with refugees is coming from Europe. And this is where I think the main role of Europe currently is. But then when it comes to helping people inside, of course, the question is, how efficient can it be there? If you already have doubts about how efficient it can be in the neighboring states, where you still can go and you can monitor and you can have access what's happening inside, that is very intransparent. Most of the aid that is going inside through the UN, that is happening. A tiny part also comes through private entities, but the majority is going through the UN. And whoever you ask, it is so difficult to control distribution, to monitor distribution, which also raised a lot of criticism, because this aid definitely helped Bashar al-Assad to survive. This aid, therefore, is part and parcel of human rights violations. While you cannot really see the effect it has, you cannot really see who it reaches in the end, because they don't, for example, draw up lists of beneficiaries in the end. You can definitely say it has propped up the regime, which is quite difficult. There has been the question, however, recently, I think even the UN Special Envoy for Syria raised it, shouldn't we lift sanctions? Given the dire economic situation that I mentioned, wouldn't the EU be in a better position, and wouldn't it be more humanitarian if the EU lifted sanctions? This is coming now from the Special Envoy. We've also seen a paper by the LSE, we've seen a paper by SWP, the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, suggesting the same. But before, interestingly, we had these suggestions by people from the political margins in Germany. Here I quoted one of the AfD people who are happy to visit Damascus, who are always speaking out in favor of the regime. And you can see as the last sentence, well, they say, oh, everything here is normal. Daily routines are normal, but because of the sanctions, the EU is not delivering milk for babies or medical supplies like prostheses or parts of medical equipment. The AfD has been hyping that quite a lot. Members of the leftist party have done so. I think Doctors Against the Nuclear War have been writing about this extensively. However, I think most of those who speak about the sanctions are not aware of what exactly is stipulated. Therefore, I copied you also the image that you can see on the right. The little symbols there are each standing for one type of sanctions. If you don't know this tool, there is a EU sanctions map online, and it's a fabulous tool because it's always up to date. You can always check exactly how a sanction is designed, when it was put in place, how it is being updated. It's amazing. It's a great tool because there also you can see the majority of sanctions are really very, very targeted. They target individuals who cannot enter Europe. They target individuals whose assets are frozen because of their involvement in human rights violations in Syria. So I think for the most part, you can straight away see they are not affecting anything that is happening inside Syria in terms of curbing humanitarian aid. And as such, humanitarian aid and medical aid are exempted from the sanctions. There is no part of the sanctions tackling them. The part about which people who are seriously talking about lifting the sanctions might be addressing is the part on sectoral sanctions, saying if, for example, you have sanctions against the banking sector that might negatively affect or even hinder the ability of the regime to pay for deliveries that they order. That is that is the only way in which it is actually possible that sanctions of the European Union affect what is happening in terms of medical and humanitarian aid. But I think it's quite a weak point because there is the possibility to ask for a waiver. And I've talked to the German foreign ministry, but also to many other foreign ministries, and I've always asked them, now in times of Corona, but also before, has there ever been a request by the Syrian regime to have medical aid and medical equipment delivered to Syria? None of them had ever received an official request. Some of them had received unofficial lists, but when checking them, it was clear that neither these items that they requested are affected by the sanctions, nor are they affected by export control for other matters. And so I think it is mainly a talking point by the regime. And I would like to draw the attention to it because it gains more dynamics. And of course, if you don't look into sanctions, you might always just think about the terrible impact that Iraq sanctions, for example, in the 90s had on the civilian population. But these sanctions are completely different, and therefore I think it is absolutely worth looking into them and seeing for yourself if you have a chance. The EU now also, because of all this array of papers recently launched saying we should consider lifting sanctions, the EU now is having a more outspoken policy of communicating about the sanctions. So this is a headline they recently had. They do more media work also to have people understand the sanctions that are in place and their impact. If you want to know what is hindering humanitarian aid, I think you should look at this map, here we see border crossings. We have in the north 2 green points, we have in the south and the very east 2 red points. These are border crossings to which humanitarian aid was delivered until January 12th. Then, even though the situation was already as terrible as it is, in the UN Security Council, Russia decided that it is not supporting these 4 access points any longer, but that it will go down to the two that are for Idlib, south and east of Syria cannot be supplied any longer cross-border. Everything that goes there has to go through the regime, which is highly inefficient. Deliveries are much scarcer than they used to be, and therefore this definitely has a measurable impact on humanitarian provisions there. So if you hear Russia particularly asking for lifting the sanctions to help the Syrian people, this is definitely something where you can say, if there is a party that would be able to do something, it would be Russia. In the Security Council, it could allow more, but it could also do more on its own. We don't see anything. Then, of course, if you talk particularly about the medical sector, in the Syrian conflict, we have seen something that other conflicts also know, the weaponization of healthcare. It is just that the extent to which this is happening in Syria is striking. There is no precedent for this. And here, this is from The Lancet. I think they published this one in 2016. I didn't find an updated one, but you can be sure it is only about the numbers. Everything that is outlined here in terms of ways of hindering medical aid is still happening. The targeting of hospitals has been very prominent. There is an excellent New York Times investigation, but also human rights organizations have been investigating it, how the Syrian regime, but also Russia itself, is targeting hospitals. Then, of course, you have arrest of medics, you have health workers arrested in specific parts of the intelligence services branches. There is a deliberate attack of the Syrian regime on healthcare. Others, of course, in this conflict have also attacked medics or hospitals. But if you look into the investigations, here you can see the number and the top 2 figures. If you just see the diagram, Syrian government forces and Syrian government or Russian forces. So really the numbers show you to which extent it is really happening by the very government that is asking for more aid and that is complaining about not getting enough aid. So therefore also I think it is absolutely worth mentioning how much of the withholding of aid and the suffering of civilians is handmade, homemade, systematically done, deliberately done by the Syrian regime. And this gives you perspective. If we decided, for example, as EU to say, well, the medical sector is so important, we don't want COVID to spread, we are afraid of other diseases to spread, let's just go for that. You can enter it, but it's not non-political. It is not neutral. It is very political. It is dangerous also because there is not a single health facility by the regime that has not been used also for torture. It's mainly the military hospitals, obviously, that are directly involved, both in torture as well as in hiding how many people actually have died in the prisons, getting rid of the bodies, but also in civilian hospitals. Doctors are forced not to treat opposition members or suspected opposition members. People have been arrested that were entered there and they were not getting medical aid on this politicized notion, and most hospitals also have torture wards or torture cells, so it is not harmless. This sector might seem so relevant, but yet to get engaged there, it really needs a very, very careful assessment on whether you can do it and whether you want to do it and whether you could become part of human rights violations through this. This brings me to war crimes. Crimes against humanity also happening here, not only on a huge scale, but also better documented than in any other conflict we currently see. We have cases, you possibly saw it in the media just now, a case opened in Koblenz where the federal prosecutor of Germany is taking 2 officials of the Syrian regime to court. There are more cases like this. There have been an arrest warrant against the head of Air Force intelligence, the most notorious branch of Syrian intelligence when it comes to torture and forced disappearances. However, for many people that would be relevant to bring to court, the problem with universal jurisdiction in Germany is that they have to be present for a trial to happen. So the two you see on trial now are relevant, definitely. They are also relevant for really making the case that this is systematic torture, that's systematic human rights violations happening not by individuals, as the Syrian regime always claims, but that there is a chain of command, that there is institutional responsibility. So I think it is very good, very symbolic, of a lot of importance to many Syrians that I know that these cases opened in Germany. Many said it's the first time that we actually see perpetrators in court, and we're not the victims. We can look them in the eye. We see them being brought to justice. I think symbolically this is very relevant, even though it might take long, and even though in comparison with how much human rights violations are happening in Syria, it's more symbolic, but I think it's a very important symbol. And I think therefore it is good that European member states that have the possibility, that are using this principle, such as Sweden, Norway, France, or Germany, are using it. And of course, we have one very important aspect that is relevant because it is so contested in Europe. Many states have problems with right-wing extremists, right-wing parties contesting people's right to seek asylum in Europe. I also have the feeling and the impression that European states are going quite far in making concessions to these currents. There is an asylum policy that more or less consists in turning people away and strengthening European borders instead of allowing people to enter. And of course, constantly there is the question, when can we send them back? We get it every year or every half year when the ministers of interior in Germany are deciding how should protection be extended. This question always comes up. Isn't it time to send people back? Where we can just state, well, there is no improvement in terms of human rights on the ground. On the contrary, we should not talk about sending people back. We should still talk more about how to have more people entering, how to enable people to really seek protection. Instead, we are insisting on having many of them risk their life to save their life. And this is why still so many people are drowning on the Mediterranean. And this is why people are stuck. When in January this offensive against Idlib happened, of the 3 million people, many of them already internally displaced in the province of Idlib, another 1 million sought refuge near the border. And it was clear Turkey would keep its border closed. And it was clear Europe was not talking at all about any program to save them. The campaign was stopped, yes, but it was by chance and it's just postponed. It is not that this campaign is cancelled, so we will face the same problem again, but there was not a single member of the European Parliament asking for bringing people from Idlib out. The campaign that happened back then and in the end resulted in 50 children to be brought from the Greek islands to Germany. That was the only campaign, and it only addressed the suffering of Greece being a primary first location for refugees to arrive to. So I think all we can see at the moment is a very, very limited readiness of European member states to deal with refugees who are already here. But I think also here, if the EU was serious and if it really wanted to do something for Syria, the question of allowing refugees from Syria to come would be relevant, because if Europe is not willing and not able to protect people who are inside, many people will still have reasons in the future to flee, and very good reasons. So I think when it comes to debating whether to send people back or bring them here, my statement would be bring more people here and be swift. Think about that. The next attempt to reconquer Idlib will result in the same numbers of refugees on the border, and there is nowhere for them to go. So therefore, I think Europe it could still do things and it should do things, but I don't really see it prepared. This is unfortunately a very depressing line to end on. I hope with your questions now you will inspire a more hopeful discussion, and by this I switch off the presentation.
Thank you very much for watching this clip with Dr. Bente Scheller, Heinrich-Böll Foundation, Berlin. We hope you enjoyed watching despite the somber and sobering tenor of the lecture, and we hope to welcome you back again on here in our research group, Comparative Politics, Middle East Politics, at the Institute of Political Science, Tübingen University. See you soon.